Rick and Morty fans think Season 9 is just another wild ride through the multiverse. 10 more episodes of chaos before the next long wait begins. But dig into the credits, the props, and the fine print buried behind each episode, and a completely different season starts to show itself. Here's everything hiding underneath 10 episodes nobody looked at twice. The surface layer, the no AI slop marketing bit. Before a single new scene of Rick and Morty played on any screen, the 9th season had already started telling its own story about itself. That story began months before the actual premiere, and almost none of it involved plot. It involved waiting, teasing, small clips, and one line of marketing copy that ended up saying more about the show's mindset than most trailers ever manage. This is where the surface of the iceberg begins, the part almost every fan already saw, and it is worth walking through slowly and in order, because the timing of it all tells you something about how carefully this season was rolled out. The wait for Season 9 was long. Fans of this show are used to gaps between seasons, sometimes gaps that stretch well past a year, and this one followed that same pattern. But underneath the wait was something steadier than usual. Back in January of 2023, the network had already locked the show in for a 10th season, long before Season 9 even had a release window. Then, in October of 2024, that deal grew again, adding 2 more full seasons on top of that, stretching the show's future all the way out to a 12th season with 20 additional episodes. That means by the time Season 9 actually arrived, the show was not fighting to prove it deserved to keep going. It already had years of guaranteed life ahead of it. Season 9 landed as a middle chapter in a much longer plan, not as a make-or-break comeback. The public build-up started quietly in February of 2026. On the 4th of that month, a short animatic clip appeared on the official YouTube channels, giving an early, rough look at part of what would become the episode titled Salute Your Morts. Animatics are simple sketch versions of scenes, made before the final color and polish are added, and releasing one that far ahead of the season was an unusual choice. It let fans see the bones of an episode months before that episode would actually air near the end of the season. At that point, nobody watching even had a premiere date yet. The next piece came in early March. On the 5th, a short promotional piece made by an artist named Paul Robertson was posted, carrying the name Megasphere. Robertson is known for a very specific, sharp, colorful animation style, and having him make a promotional short for the season signaled that the visuals were going to be treated as something worth showing off on their own, separate from any actual episode content. This short also did one important job. It confirmed, officially, that the new season would be arriving sometime that year, 2026. Up until that point, that had only been assumed. Then, on March the 11th, the actual date arrived. The network announced that Season 9 would begin on May the 24th, and released the first official poster for the season. That poster showed a scene where Rick is shown stretching his body while lunging at a barrier that evil Morty is generating, a direct visual nod to a fight that happens in the very first episode of the season. Posters like this are usually built well after the episode footage exists, which means the choice to put that particular image front and center was made deliberately, to hit early that the season was going to open with a serious, high-stakes fight rather than a smaller, quieter story. Through the rest of March, small clips kept arriving one at a time. On the 12th, a clip from an episode called Ericerhead went out on the official channels. On the 23rd, a short clip from Rick's Days 7 Nights followed. On the 30th, the European division of the network posted its own short clip as well, keeping international fans in the loop at the same pace as audiences in the United States. Each of these clips was brief, usually just a few seconds, enough to spark conversation without giving away how any of the actual stories would unfold. April brought the biggest wave of promotion. On the 1st of the month, during an unrelated April Fool's marathon for another animated show called Smiling Friends, a clip from the episode Requiem Mort a Dream aired publicly for the first time, tucked inside programming that had nothing to do with Rick and Morty on paper. That same clip later reappeared on the European YouTube channel in May, closer to when that specific episode would actually air. On April the 7th, the first full trailer for the season went up, set to the song Rebel Yell by Billy Idol, a fast, aggressive rock track that matched the tone the trailer was going for. Then, on April the 15th, something bigger happened. The network revealed the titles of all 10 episodes for the season at once, alongside rough early animatics for each one. This is not something every season gets. Usually, titles are revealed one at a time as episodes approach, keeping most of the season a mystery. Giving fans the full list of 10 titles that early meant the puzzle solving could begin months before a single full episode existed to confirm any of it. On that same day, day, a short video announcing the titles included appearances from the core voice cast, along with the show's co-creator, giving fans a rare glimpse of the people behind the characters talking about the season directly. The rollout kept building through the rest of April. On the 19th, production art started appearing on social media, giving a look at some of the visual design work behind specific scenes. On the 22nd, a second poster went up, and the show's official accounts changed their profile pictures and banner images to match the new season's branding. This second poster showed the Smith family defending themselves while standing together on a couch, with the floor around them covered in lava, a clear reference to a sequence that plays out in the episode A Ricker Runs Through It.
That same poster also included an image of Rick's head and body appearing to fight against each other, tying back to the Erickerhead episode already teased in March. On the 29th, a short clip from A Ricker Runs Through It went out, and the official website for the show was refreshed and updated to promote the new season properly, with new artwork and information replacing the older season's material. May kept the pace going right up until the actual premiere. On the 5th, the opening title sequence for the season was released publicly ahead of time, giving fans a full look at the sequence that would play at the start of every episode all season. On the 12th, a second full trailer arrived, offering a wider look at more scenes from across the 10 episodes, rather than focusing narrowly on one or two moments. Then, starting the following week, the network began releasing a short early preview clip for each individual episode on Thursdays, just a few days ahead of that week's Sunday premiere. This turned the entire season into a steady weekly rhythm long before the first episode even aired, training viewers to expect a small taste every Thursday and the full episode every Sunday. The premiere finally arrived on Sunday, May the 24th at 11 at night, Eastern and Pacific Time, airing on the same late-night adult animation block the show has always called home. From there, new episodes continued weekly, every Sunday at the same time, running for 10 total episodes before wrapping up on July the 26th. This weekly Sunday pattern held steady across the entire season without a single week skipped, which is worth noting on its own, since long-running shows sometimes lose a week here or there to scheduling shifts or breaks. Season 9 did not. Streaming access followed a slightly separate timeline from the television broadcast. In the United States, new episodes became available to watch weekly on two major streaming platforms starting June the 15th, several weeks after the season had already begun airing on cable. This gap between the television premiere and the streaming release has existed in past seasons too, sometimes stretching out much longer than it did this time. The person running the show as its current lead producer spoke publicly about wanting that gap to shrink, expressing frustration with the traditional way these release windows have worked in the past, and pushing for a faster turnaround so streaming viewers would not have to wait as long. For international audiences, the wait was much shorter. Viewers across Europe were able to stream new episodes on the same major platform starting May the 25th, just one day after each episode aired live in the United States, giving international fans faster access than viewers using streaming in the show's own home country. Physical media collectors were given their own date to look forward to as well. A Blu-ray and standard DVD release for the full season was confirmed for November the 3rd, giving fans who prefer to own a hard copy of the season a clear point on the calendar to wait for, arriving a few months after the season would finish airing entirely. Now, back to that one line of marketing language that stuck with a lot of people more than any trailer or poster did. When the season was first properly announced, the official description leaned hard into a very specific joke. It framed the season as being made the old-fashioned way, by regular working people, rather than by any kind of automated tool, poking fun at itself by describing its own writers and artists using blunt, unglamorous, physical language about ordinary human bodies. It was a joke, but it landed at a moment when a lot of conversations across the entertainment industry were focused on the growing use of automated tools in writing and art, and plenty of creators and audiences were nervous about what that might mean for shows like this one going forward. By putting that joke directly into its own official season description, the show planted its flag early, publicly stating that the season had been written and drawn by actual people sitting in actual rooms, before a single frame had even aired. It was a small detail, easy to laugh at and move past, but it tells you something about how aware the people making this season were of the conversations happening around them in the wider industry at that exact moment in time. The voice cast carrying this season into being is worth sitting with for a moment too, mostly because of how steady it has remained. Rick Sanchez is voiced by Ian Cardoni, and Morty Smith is voiced by Harry Belden, both of them having stepped into these roles a few seasons back. Summer Smith continues to be voiced by Spencer Grammer, and Beth Smith, along with her alternate version known as Space Beth, continues to be voiced by Sarah Chalk. Jerry Smith remains voiced by Chris Parnell. This lineup has stayed consistent for several seasons running now, which matters because the show went through a major behind-the-scenes change a a few years before this season existed. Back in January of 2023, the network ended its working relationship with one of the show's original co-creators, following domestic abuse charges brought against him. That change reshaped who was in the recording booth voicing these characters. But by the time Season 9 came around, the newer voice lineup had already settled into a steady rhythm of its own, with the same core group of actors returning together season after season. The show's other original co-creator continues to be involved as an executive producer, alongside the person who has served as the show's day-to-day showrunner for a number of seasons now. One more piece worth mentioning, while still on the surface level, sits just outside the season itself. A separate spin-off project, centered on a character called President Curtis, is set to arrive later in the same month the season wraps up, expanding the wider universe this show exists inside beyond just the flagship series. A promotional piece for that spin-off aired publicly during the same week one of Season 9's own episodes premiered, tying the two projects together in terms of timing, even though they are technically separate shows. Combined with the multi-season renewal already locked in through Season 12, this points to a much bigger, longer-term plan sitting behind this one season, one that stretches well past the 10 episodes airing right now. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. All of that sits at the very top of the iceberg, the part almost anyone who watched a single trailer would already know. What comes next digs into the first episode itself and the blackmail plot it had been quietly sitting on since a season finale years earlier. Section 2. Evil Morty's blackmail arc finally resolves. The first episode of Season 9 does something a lot of viewers might not clock while they are watching it. It quietly closes a story that had been sitting open since a season finale years earlier, one built around a character who has haunted the show without needing to appear very often at all. That character is the one fans nicknamed Evil Morty, long before the show itself ever said those two words out loud on screen. Understanding what gets resolved in this opening episode means understanding where this particular Morty came from, and just how long the show has been quietly building toward this exact moment. This version of Morty first showed up wearing an eye patch, appearing briefly in an earlier season during an episode where many different versions of Rick and Morty from across the multiverse cross paths with each other. At the time, nothing about him stood out as important. He was just one more face in a crowd of alternate Mortys, background noise in a busy episode full of them. Fans only started paying closer attention to him later, once they realized the same eye patch kept showing up again in future seasons, always attached to a Morty who seemed sharper, colder, and far more in control than any other version of the character had ever been. His next major appearance came in an episode set entirely inside a place called the Citadel, a massive city built by and for the countless Ricks and Mortys who exist across every version of reality. In that episode, this same Morty had risen all the way to the very top, holding the highest position of power inside that entire society. He was not hiding anymore. He was running things. And by the end of that episode, the show revealed something disturbing sitting underneath his rise to power. Something that made it clear this Morty was operating on a completely different level than any other version of himself the show had shown before. For a long stretch after that, this Morty vanished from the show entirely. Seasons passed without a single mention of him. Then he returned in a season finale, and that return changed the entire shape of what fans understood the character to be. In that finale, this Morty was finally given his nickname on screen for the first time. Up until that point, fans had been the ones calling him Evil Morty, using it as an unofficial shorthand because the show itself had never actually said it. People working on the show behind the scenes had reportedly used the same nickname among themselves for a while too, even though it had never made it into an actual script. That finale changed that. The character himself, during a moment of reflection on his own actions, openly acknowledged what he had become using that exact word. A separate character then repeated the nickname directly afterward, making it official rather than just a fan invention. That same finale ended with a direct confrontation between this Morty and Rick C-137, the specific version of Rick the show follows as its main character. During that fight, Evil Morty made it clear he had grown powerful enough to threaten Rick and his family without needing to lift a finger personally. He told Rick plainly that he could end what he called the Rick experiment whenever he chose to, and warned Rick to leave him alone going forward. He then walked away from the confrontation entirely, choosing not to finish what he had started, seemingly satisfied that the threat alone would be enough to keep Rick from ever coming after him again. That threat did not disappear once the episode ended. It sat there, unresolved, for the audience to wonder about across an entire gap between seasons. And when Season 9 finally opened, it turned out that threat had never actually gone away behind the scenes either. It had simply been running quietly in the background the entire
entire time, completely unknown to the audience until the very first episode of the new season pulled the curtain back. The opening episode of Season 9 reveals that evil Morty had spent the years since that finale forcing Rick C-137 into a private arrangement neither Morty Prime nor the rest of the Smith family knew anything about. Evil Morty had built a device, the same kind of device he had threatened Rick with before, and rigged it with a safety mechanism designed to trigger automatically if anything ever happened to him. Inside that device, he had trapped small copies of Rick's own family, holding them as leverage. If evil Morty were harmed in any way, the device would activate on its own and erase those copies from existence completely.
Rick, faced with that threat, had been secretly helping evil Morty with various jobs across the years, cleaning up dangerous situations and threats on his behalf, all while keeping his own grandson completely in the dark about any of it. Morty Prime only finds out about this arrangement by accident, stumbling onto a conversation between Rick and evil Morty that he was never supposed to see. His reaction is exactly what fans might expect. He is furious that Rick has been secretly working for someone the show has already established as dangerous, someone capable of threatening their entire family without needing to be anywhere near them. Rick tries to explain the situation, laying out exactly what is at stake and why he felt he had no real choice. But the explanation does little to calm Morty down, given how much has clearly been hidden from him. Before that conversation can go much further, evil Morty himself shows up in person, appearing directly inside the garage. He announces that he needs Rick's help again, this time for something bigger than the usual job, and casually extends the invitation to Morty Prime as well, almost as if daring him to come along and see for himself what his grandfather has been dealing with. The three of them travel together to evil Morty's private base of operations, and it is there that Morty Prime sees the device firsthand for the first time. Inside it are small copies of his own mother, father, and sister, kept as leverage exactly as Rick had described. Morty notices something specific and unsettling almost immediately. There is no copy of himself trapped inside the device. When he asks why, evil Morty explains it plainly. Keeping a copy of Morty Prime inside the same device that holds a copy of Rick would create too much risk of accidentally erasing himself in the process, given how tightly the two of them are connected across the multiverse. It is a small detail, but it tells the audience something important about how carefully calculated evil Morty's leverage really is. Nothing about the arrangement is accidental. Evil Morty then lays out the actual mission facing all three of them. He has discovered a massive, multiversal threat referred to as the Collective, an entity capable of absorbing anything it comes into contact with, growing stronger and larger with every single thing it consumes. The Collective has already begun assimilating other beings and threatens to spread across the entire section of the multiverse the show refers to as the Central Finite Curve, the specific stretch of realities Rick and his family exist inside. Since teleporting directly into the Collective's location carries serious risk, evil Morty has Rick drive all three of them there the old-fashioned way instead, turning the mission into an actual road trip of sorts before the real fighting even begins. What follows is a genuinely large-scale fight sequence, one animated with noticeably more polish and fluidity than a typical episode gets, suggesting the studio treated this particular battle as a showcase moment for the season opener. Rick and evil Morty end up fighting side by side against the Collective's forces at several points throughout the sequence, at one point standing back to back against a wave of enemies in a way the show clearly plays as a genuine team moment rather than a forced alliance. The two of them, both extremely intelligent and dangerous in their own right, prove to be a surprisingly effective pair once they are actually working toward the same goal instead of against each other. This creates an uncomfortable moment for Morty Prime, who watches the two of them fight together and notices something that clearly bothers him. Rick and evil Morty have real chemistry as a team, the kind of coordinated back and forth Morty Prime himself has spent years building with his own grandfather. Morty even notes to himself that whatever friendly behavior Rick shows toward evil Morty during the mission might partly be an act, but the effectiveness of their teamwork together is not something he can fully dismiss, and it clearly gets under his skin watching it happen in front of him. During the fight, evil Morty makes use of a powerful weapon built into the palm of his hand, capable of vaporizing enemies in a single blast. It is genuinely dangerous, strong enough to completely destroy one particular character in a single hit, and very nearly do the same to Jerry moments later. But the weapon comes with a real limitation. After firing, it needs roughly 20 seconds before it can fire again, and that gap becomes the exact window the Smith family uses to fight back and gain the upper hand whenever the weapon gets pointed at them. It is a small mechanical detail, but it matters because it keeps evil Morty from simply overpowering everyone around him effortlessly. Even someone this dangerous still has a weakness that ordinary teamwork can exploit. The collective itself ends up being defeated through a clever trick rather than brute force. Rick manages to slip it a piece of technology designed to compress information down as tightly as possible. Once the collective absorbs that piece of technology, along with everything else it has taken in, the compression effect turns its own core ability against it. Instead of continuing to absorb everything around it, the collective becomes trapped in an endless loop of absorbing itself over and over, permanently, with no way to stop.
It is a fitting kind of ending for a villain whose entire identity was built around consuming absolutely everything it touched. The very thing that made it dangerous becomes the exact thing that destroys it. With the immediate threat handled, the episode shifts into a much quieter scene. The three of them go to a diner together to eat, a moment that seems almost like a reward after such a large fight, but the tone shifts quickly once they sit down. Evil Morty starts taunting Morty Prime directly, needling him about not measuring up compared to how well Rick and Evil Morty work together. He points out, almost bragging, how much more relaxed and open Rick seems to be around him, even mentioning that Rick has shown him things he has never shown Morty Prime, including private information the show has referred to before as Rick's time travel stuff, a phrase tied to an actual storage box the show has shown sitting inside the garage across multiple earlier episodes. Evil Morty even hints outright that he would like to take Rick away from Morty Prime entirely, a direct and deliberately cruel thing to say to someone who has just watched his grandfather fight alongside this exact person for the better part of an hour. Morty Prime, clearly annoyed and hurt by the taunting, gets up and excuses himself to the bathroom, rather than sit there and keep absorbing it. Rick follows shortly after, giving his own excuse for stepping away, one that plays as a crude joke on the surface, but ends up carrying real weight once the episode reveals what actually happened during that break. When Rick returns to the table, he is noticeably more relaxed, joking that whatever just happened in the bathroom genuinely improved his mood, and he becomes far more willing to sit back down and finish the meal with everyone. On the surface, it plays as a simple gross-out joke, the kind of thing this show has never been shy about using for a laugh. But the episode reveals afterward that Rick used that exact window of time for something far more important than the joke suggests. Once Evil Morty finally returns to his own base after the meal, he discovers the device holding his leverage has been completely destroyed, along with every file connected to it. The only thing left behind inside the wreckage is a single photograph of Rick mooning the camera directly, clearly left behind on purpose as a final message. Rick had used that short bathroom break not for anything crude at all, but to sneak back and permanently destroy the device holding his family hostage, freeing himself from the entire arrangement Evil Morty had been using to control him for years. As Rick and Morty Prime head back home afterward, Rick finally explains to Morty exactly what he did. He fed the original blueprints for the device directly into the device itself, causing it to erase itself completely and permanently across every single version of reality where it might have existed. The exact method mirrors how the collective itself was defeated only a short time earlier in the same episode, using an enemy's own core function against it until it collapses in on itself. This ending closes out a storyline the show had left completely open since that earlier season finale, years before this episode ever aired. Fans who remembered that confrontation and the quiet threat Evil Morty made as he walked away from it now finally get to see what had actually been happening behind the scenes the entire time that threat sat unresolved. It also puts something to rest that fans of this character had been debating for a long time. There had always been a real question hanging over whether Evil Morty would ever return to directly threaten Rick and his family again, given how openly dangerous he had proven himself to be in every earlier appearance. This episode answers that question by giving the entire conflict between them a clean, final ending, one that removes the leverage entirely, rather than simply delaying the threat further down the road. A handful of smaller details tie this episode even more tightly to the show's earlier seasons for anyone paying close attention. During the fight, Evil Morty is placed inside a restraining net at one point, a direct callback to an earlier episode where Rick specifically instructed Morty Prime to use a net to hold Evil Morty in place if he was ever encountered again. A robotic butler character also reappears during the episode, one the show had previously shown serving Evil Morty inside his own private space in an earlier season. And once the immediate threat has been dealt with, Evil Morty is eventually sent off to a specific prison built to hold people who misuse time travel, a location the show had only mentioned by name once before, years earlier, without ever actually showing it on screen until now. The episode borrows a fair number of small references from outside the show as well. At one point, Rick compares Evil Morty directly to a character named Q from an older science fiction television series, a being known for being nearly impossible to predict or control. The collective itself plays as a clear homage to a specific kind of overwhelming cosmic threat found in superhero comics, the type of villain whose entire purpose is consuming everything smaller than itself. During his fight with Evil Morty, Rick is shown wearing a robotic frame underneath his skin that visually echoes a famous killer robot from an older science fiction film franchise. And the type of net used to trap Evil Morty during the fight closely resembles a specific piece of equipment from an older video game series built entirely around trapping strange creatures using a net gun. Taken together, this opening episode does a lot of quiet work before the season has even had a chance to properly begin. It resolves a threat that had been sitting untouched since a finale years earlier. It gives Evil Morty a proper send-off rather than simply writing him out with no explanation. And it does all of this while still delivering one of the biggest action sequences the show has put together in recent memory. Fans walked away from this episode with a genuine sense of closure on a storyline that had been open for a very long time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That sense of closure did not last very long once the second episode began, because Rick immediately does something the show has only done once before across its entire run, wiping his own memory clean and stepping into a completely different identity, one that would end up putting his own family through a very different kind of chaos entirely. Section 3. The doofus Rick-style callback nobody clocks, Ted. The first episode of Season 9 ends with Rick admitting something out loud that he rarely says without some kind of joke attached to it. After everything that happened with Evil Morty, after destroying the device that had been holding his family hostage for years, Rick tells his family plainly that he needs a vacation. It sounds like a throwaway line at the time, the kind of thing a tired person says after a long day. The second episode of the season takes that single sentence and builds an entire story around it. And the story it builds turns out to be far stranger and more layered than a simple trip away from home. The episode is called Rick's Days 7 Nights, and it opens with Rick already gone. He is shown living on a planet called Belloy 6E, and he is not living there as Rick. He has taken on a completely different identity, a persona he calls Ted. Ted has no memory of being Rick at all. He does not know about the multiverse, the portal gun, Evil Morty, or any part of the life Rick actually lives. As far as Ted is concerned, Ted is simply Ted, a regular guy enjoying time on a planet he thinks of as a nice place to relax. This is not a disguise Rick is wearing on purpose while secretly remembering who he really is underneath. Rick has actually erased his own memory completely, wiping away every trace of his real identity so thoroughly that Ted has no idea Rick Sanchez ever existed in the first place. This is only the second time across the entire show that Rick has fully erased his own memory this way. The first time happened during an earlier season, in an episode called Morty's Mind Blowers, and that first erasure was not something Rick planned or chose. It happened by accident, as a side effect of something else going on in that episode, and Morty ended up having his memory wiped along with Rick's own. What makes the version in Rick's Days 7 Nights different is that this one is entirely deliberate. Rick chose to do this to himself. Nobody forced his hand, and nothing went wrong by accident. He specifically wanted to disappear from his own life for a while, so completely that even he would not know he was doing it, and building the alter ego of Ted was how he made that happen. Back at home, while Rick is off living as Ted with no memory of his real family, everyone left behind starts noticing his absence in different ways. Rick has used various types of holograms throughout the show before to communicate with his family while he is away. In this episode continues that pattern, showing Rick attempting to use similar hologram technology to try reaching Ted and snap him out of the persona he has built for himself. These holograms had shown up in earlier seasons too, used to talk to Morty and Summer during other times Rick needed to check in from somewhere far away. Using that same method here ties this episode back to a tool the show has relied on more than once, rather than inventing a brand new gadget just for this specific story. Ted's life on Belloy 6E is shown in some detail, and several small pieces of it connect directly back to earlier parts of the show in ways that reward close attention. Ted spends time in a pool set up in the yard, and that exact pool had first appeared just one episode earlier in the season opener, meaning the show placed this detail there on purpose so it could be reused here rather than building something new from scratch. Summer is shown going back to that same pool later in the episode too, tying the location together across both episodes even more tightly. Ted also activates a cabinet full of weapons kept inside the garage, and that same weapons cabinet had already appeared twice before, once in an earlier season episode, and again in the very episode right before this one. A minor character named Bowser mentions to Ted that Beth has made pancakes again, and pancakes showing up in the Smith household is something the show has repeated across a long list of earlier episodes, stretching all the way back to some of its earliest seasons.
reasons. None of these details change the plot in any major way. They simply prove that whoever wrote this episode was paying close attention to small, ordinary details the show had already built up over the years, and chose to fold those same details back into Ted's version of life at the house, rather than starting completely fresh. A stranger detail involves a drink called Foamies. At one point, Ted is shown with a can of it while relaxing in the pool, and Foamies is something Rick has actually had before in an earlier season episode, later appearing again in 2 more episodes after that. Seeing Ted holding the exact same drink Rick has been shown drinking multiple times across the show's history is a small, almost silly way of hinting that Ted's habits and tastes line up suspiciously well with Rick's own, even though Ted has no memory of being Rick at all. It plants a quiet clue for anyone paying attention, long before the episode ever explains what is actually going on. The portal gun itself becomes part of the story too. At one point, after using it, Ted discovers that its portal fluid is running low, the exact same problem Morty ran into in a much earlier episode of the show. Ted even ends up getting a drop of that fluid on the dining room table, mirroring almost exactly how Morty got a drop of the same fluid on his own hand back in that earlier episode. And later in the episode, the Smith family is shown playing a board game called Downbeat, a game the show has shown them playing together in 2 separate earlier episodes already. Taken together, these small details suggest the person writing this episode went out of their way to reuse specific, minor pieces of the show's history, rather than treating each new episode as a totally blank slate. For longtime fans, catching these tiny, repeated details is part of the fun. For anyone watching casually, they slide by completely unnoticed, which is exactly what makes them the kind of thing worth pointing out separately like this. The heart of the episode is really about how Rick, as Ted, slowly starts remembering pieces of who he actually is, while Morty tries desperately to help pull those memories back to the surface. This entire structure closely mirrors a well-known 2-part story from a much older science fiction show, one where a powerful, ancient character hides himself inside an ordinary human identity to escape from a threat, only for someone close to him to spend the whole story trying to bring the real him back before it is too late. The parallel is not subtle once it's pointed out. In the type of story being told, a powerful being pretending to be someone completely ordinary while people around him try to wake him up follows the same basic shape almost beat for beat. 2 other outside references show up during key moments of the episode as well. At one point, Rick gives Ted a direct choice between 2 options, represented by a red button and a blue button, forcing him to decide whether he wants to become Rick again or continue living the rest of his life as Ted. This mirrors a famous scene from a well-known science fiction film where a character is offered a red pill or a blue pill, each one representing a completely different path forward, one that leads back to painful truth and one that leads to comfortable ignorance. Later, while appearing as a hologram trying to reach Ted, Rick mentions that he had once considered programming backup versions of himself into these same holograms, specifically in case a situation like the plot of a particular action film about a kidnapped family member were ever to happen to his own family. Both of these moments work as quick jokes on their own, but they also fit neatly into the episode's larger theme of someone hiding their true identity while people who care about them try to break through that disguise. Music plays a bigger role in this specific episode than in a lot of others across the show. When Ted and a group of friends build a small ship together at one point in the story, the song playing underneath that scene is Big Iron, an older country tune by Marty Robbins about a lone gunslinger riding into a small town. Later, when Ted goes on a wild, chaotic trip jumping between different locations, the song shifts to Waiting Around to Die by Townes Van Zandt, a much bleaker, slower song than the one used earlier, matching the darker tone of that particular stretch of the episode. And during the closing credits, an original song titled 4 Ages plays, credited to a group called Wax//Wayne, along with Ryan Elder, one of the show's regular composers. Choosing 3 very different pieces of music for 3 very different moods across a single episode shows a level of care in matching sound to story that easy to miss if someone is only half paying attention while the episode plays in the background. Even the setting Ted visits gets a small joke buried inside it. At one point, Ted is shown shopping at a store called L-Mart, a clear stand-in for the real-world store chain Kmart, which shut down the majority of its locations in recent years. Swapping the K for an L is exactly the kind of small, silly wordplay this show leans on constantly, poking fun at a real-world brand without using its actual name directly. By the end of the episode, once Ted's memories fully return and Rick is himself again, the show reveals that Ted had started a relationship with someone named Marjorie during his time on Beloy 6E, and Marjorie has red hair. This detail connects to something Rick said himself.
out loud back in an earlier season episode about having a personal preference for redheads. Seeing that same detail resurface here, attached to Rick's alter ego rather than Rick directly, raises an interesting question about how much of Ted's personality was really a brand new character, and how much of it was simply Rick's own true preferences and instincts leaking through, even with his memory completely gone. That detail on its own deserves a much closer look, because it turns out this is not the only place in the episode where the color of someone's hair was chosen on purpose rather than by accident. One more thing about Ted stands out on a rewatch. His personality while living as this alter ego, described by fans as extremely intense and over the top, closely echoes how Rick himself acted way back in the show's very earliest episodes, including the original pilot and a couple of the episodes that followed shortly after it. Early seasons of the show gave Rick a rougher, wilder edge that softened somewhat as the show went on, and gave him more room for quieter, more emotional moments. Watching Ted behave with that same rougher energy, without having any memory of being Rick at all, suggests that some core piece of Rick's personality sits underneath the surface, no matter what name he is using or how much of his memory is missing at any given time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This episode also happened to bring in a noticeably large group of guest stars, all of them voicing side characters woven into Ted's temporary life on Beloy 6E. On their own, none of these voices are the kind of thing a casual listener would necessarily recognize by name. But once someone realizes exactly where every single one of these guest voices actually come from, and what they all have in common with each other outside of this show entirely, the choice starts to look a lot less random and a lot more deliberate. Section 4. A full Office cast reunion, hiding in plain sight. Rick's Days 7 Nights carries a guest cast that looks, on the surface, like a random handful of comedic voices filling out minor roles on an alien planet. Look closer at where each of those 5 names actually comes from, and the randomness disappears completely. Every single one of them shares the exact same show on their resume, a workplace comedy that ran for years and became one of the most rewatched sitcoms of its era. Putting all 5 of them into a single episode together was not an accident of scheduling. It was a reunion, quietly built into an animated science fiction show, hiding right there for anyone who bothered to look up the names in the credits. The show connecting all 5 of these performers is The Office, the American version of the mockumentary-style workplace comedy that followed a group of employees at a mid-sized paper supply company in a small city in Pennsylvania. The show ran for 9 seasons and became one of the defining sitcoms of its time, known for its awkward silences, its fake documentary camera style, and its enormous cast of memorable side characters who all worked in the same cramped office space together. Anyone who watched even a handful of episodes of that show over the years would likely recognize these 5 names the moment they saw them, even if they never expected to hear their voices coming out of an animated alien planet in a completely different show years later. Amy Ryan was one of the 5 guest stars in this episode, and on The Office, she played a character named Holly Flax, a warm and quirky human resources representative who was transferred into the branch partway through the show's run. Holly quickly became one of the most significant romantic partners for the main character of the series, a relationship the show returned to across several seasons, even as she moved in and out of the main cast, depending on how her character's job assignments shifted. Ryan's performance as Holly earned real praise during the show's run, largely because her chemistry with the lead character felt different from most of the other relationships the show had tried building up to that point. Beyond The Office, Ryan has built a long and serious acting career across film and television, earning recognition for dramatic roles as well as comedic ones, making her one of the more versatile performers among this particular group of guest stars. Ed Helms played Andy Bernard on The Office, a character who started out as a minor supporting figure early in the show's run, and eventually grew into one of its most central characters by the later seasons, even taking over as the branch's manager for a stretch of episodes once the original manager left the company. Andy was known for his eagerness to fit in, his complicated relationship with several other characters in The Office, and his habit of breaking into song at moments nobody around him particularly wanted him to. Around the same time he was appearing on The Office, Helms was also becoming known to much wider audiences through a series of hit comedy films that turned him into one of the more recognizable comedic actors working in film during that stretch of years. Having someone with that level of mainstream recognition lending his voice to a background character in this episode is the kind of casting choice that could easily slip past someone who was not specifically
specifically looking for it. Oscar Nunez played a character actually named Oscar Martinez on The Office, one of the show's accountants and one of its steadier, more grounded characters compared to some of the louder personalities surrounding him in that office. Oscar was often used by the show as the character reacting to chaos around him with dry, unimpressed commentary, giving the audience a grounded voice inside a workplace that frequently spiraled into absurd situations. Nunez remained a consistent part of the show's ensemble across its entire run, appearing in far more episodes than several other cast members who came and went over the years, making him one of the more reliable presences throughout the series, from its earliest seasons all the way to its finale.
Paul Lieberstein is a slightly different kind of name on this list compared to the other four, because his connection to The Office runs in two separate directions at once. On screen, he played Toby Flinderson, The Office's human resources representative for most of the show's run, a character deliberately written to be one of the most disliked figures among the main cast, largely because of his tense relationship with the show's lead character, who treated him with open contempt for reasons that were more about personality clashes than anything Toby actually did wrong. But behind the scenes, Lieberstein's role on the show went far beyond acting. He worked as a writer and producer across the show's entire run, and he served as the show's showrunner for a period of time as well, meaning he had a direct hand in shaping the direction of the series from behind the camera, in addition to appearing in front of it.
Having someone with that dual background, both performer and behind-the-scenes creative leader, join this particular guest cast adds another layer to how deliberately this reunion appears to have been assembled. Rob Riggle rounds out the group, and his connection to The Office is smaller than the other four in terms of screen time, having appeared in a more limited capacity compared to cast members who were part of the show across its full run. Riggle has built a broad career across film, television, and stand-up comedy, often appearing in supporting comedic roles across a wide range of projects, rather than being tied closely to any single show the way some of the other four performers on this list have been. His inclusion here rounds out a guest list built entirely from a single sitcom's ensemble, even though his own footprint on that specific show was smaller than his four fellow guest stars in this episode.
Taken together, these five people did not simply happen to end up in the same recording booth by pure coincidence. Every one of them has a direct, verifiable connection to the exact same workplace comedy, spanning years of that show's run and touching nearly every corner of its ensemble, from its central romantic subplot to its background accountant to its most disliked authority figure to a writer and producer who helped steer the show from behind the scenes. Assembling a guest cast with that much overlap takes deliberate planning. It does not happen by accident when a casting team is simply looking for 5 funny voices to fill out a handful of side characters in a single episode. This kind of layered guest casting fits a pattern this show has leaned on more than once across its history.
Adult animated shows aimed at older audiences often use guest voice work as a quiet reward for longtime, detail-oriented viewers, embedding jokes and references that only land fully for someone willing to look past the episode itself and into the credits behind it. A casual viewer watching Rick's Days 7 Nights simply hears 5 voices playing minor characters scattered across Ted's temporary life on an alien planet. Nothing about the episode itself announces that these particular 5 actors all share the exact same show on their resume. There is no wink to the camera, no in-joke spoken out loud by any of the characters acknowledging the connection. The only way to catch it is to actually go looking at who voiced what, matching names against a separate show entirely, and noticing that every single one of them lines up with the same source.
This kind of hidden guest casting reunion also raises a broader point worth sitting with, about how modern animated comedy shows build their guest lists in general. Casting directors for shows like this one are often working with agents and actors who already know each other personally, sometimes through years of working on the exact same sets together. Reaching out to a group of performers who already have an existing friendship or professional relationship with each other can make a recording session easier to schedule and often produces more natural, comfortable performances, since the actors involved are already familiar with each other's rhythms and comedic timing from years of shared experience working side by side. Whether that was the specific reasoning behind bringing these 5 particular actors together for this episode is not something publicly confirmed, but the pattern itself, casting groups of performers who already share history together, rather than assembling 5 complete strangers for a single afternoon of recording, is a common and practical approach used across the animation industry more broadly. It is also worth noting how differently these 5 careers have branched out since The Office ended its run. Some of them, like Ed Helms, moved heavily into big
screen comedy work that reached enormous mainstream audiences well beyond anyone who specifically watched their original sitcom. Others, like Amy Ryan, split their time between comedic work and more serious dramatic roles across film and television, building a career that resists being boxed into just one type of performance. Paul Lieberstein largely stepped back from acting in later years to focus more heavily on writing and producing work behind the scenes on other projects. And Oscar Nunez and Rob Riggle have both continued working steadily across television and film in smaller, frequently recurring roles rather than headlining major projects on their own. Seeing all 5 of these different career paths converge again, years later, inside a single animated science fiction episode says something about how enduring that original workplace comedy's cast chemistry really was. Long after the show itself ended, these 5 people were still recognizable enough as a connected group that bringing them back together for even a small guest voice project still carried weight for anyone who noticed the pattern. None of this changes the actual plot of the episode in any meaningful way. Ted's story on Beloy 6E plays out exactly the same, whether or not a viewer ever realizes these 5 guest voices share a common show in their past. The memory loss, the slow return of Rick's real identity, the red and blue button choice, the eventual reveal about Marjorie's red hair. None of that depends on catching this particular detail, but that is exactly what makes it worth pulling apart on its own. It is a piece of trivia sitting completely outside the story itself, built purely for the benefit of anyone curious enough to check where 5 familiar-sounding voices actually came from. It adds nothing to the plot and changes nothing about how the episode resolves, and yet it clearly took real thought and planning to put together in the first place. This particular episode ends up carrying an unusually high number of separate details worth digging into, far more than a typical episode tends to hold on to in one place. Between the memory wipe itself, the returning props and locations reused from earlier episodes, the outside references borrowed from an older science fiction show and a well-known film, the 3 very different songs chosen for 3 very different moods, and now this fully connected guest cast pulled entirely from a single sitcom's ensemble, Rick's Days, 7 Nights, turns out to be a much denser episode than its fairly simple, straightforward setup would suggest at first glance. A story about a man who forgets who he is and slowly gets pieced back together by the people who love him could easily have been told with far less buried underneath the surface. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That red hair belonging to Marjorie, mentioned only briefly in passing so far, connects to something the show planted years earlier, and it does not stop with just her. Section 5. Erickerhead's Meta Warner Brothers gag. Before the redhead thread goes any further, it is worth mentioning where it lands. The pattern planted with Marjorie in the second episode does not stop with her. A minor character named Salpak is shown in a relationship with another red-headed alien in a short scene tucked after the credits of that same episode, meaning the show repeated the exact same detail twice within a single episode, rather than using it just once. 2 separate characters, 2 separate redheads, both lining up with something Rick said about himself years earlier. That is where that particular thread settles, and it is a good example of how this season keeps folding tiny, easy-to-miss details back into itself, rather than treating every scene as something brand new. The 6th episode of the season carries a title built on the exact same wordplay habit the show has used constantly across its entire run, taking a well-known piece of outside media and jamming the word Rick into the middle of it somehow. This time, the target is Eraserhead, a black and white film released in 1977, directed by a filmmaker named David Lynch. Eraserhead followed a man living in a bleak industrial world who becomes the reluctant father of a strange, deformed infant, and it became known over the years for its unsettling, dreamlike imagery, especially involving its main character's unusually large, upright head of hair. The film has stuck around in film history discussions for decades because of how strange and disturbing its visuals are, even by the standards of experimental filmmaking from that era. Taking a title like that and turning it into Erickerhead follows the exact same formula the show has used for entire seasons worth of episode titles, swapping in a piece of the word Rick somewhere inside a familiar name everyone already recognizes. What makes this particular title pairing interesting is how directly the actual plot of the episode leans into the literal meaning of the film it borrows its name from. Eraserhead is remembered specifically for its imagery involving a head that behaves strangely and separately from the rest of a person's body, floating and existing on its own in some of the film's most famous scenes. Erickerhead takes that same idea and turns it into the actual plot of the episode itself, showing Rick's own head and body coming coming apart and ending up in direct conflict with each other. This was confirmed well before the episode ever aired, since the second official poster release for the season features this exact image sitting alongside two other confirmed scenes from separate episodes, showing Rick's head and body detached and physically fighting one another as one of three key visuals chosen to represent the entire season. Putting that image on an official poster months ahead of the premiere signals that the people marketing the season saw this particular sequence as something worth showing off early, treating it as one of the season's more memorable visual moments rather than a small, forgettable gag buried somewhere in the middle of an episode nobody would remember later. A short clip from this episode reached the public earlier than almost anything else released for the entire season. On March the 12th, months before the season had a confirmed premiere date, the official channels released a brief look at Eric Head specifically, ahead of similar early clips for other episodes that followed later that same month. Releasing footage from this particular episode that early, well before most of the season's marketing had even ramped up, suggests it was seen as strong enough on its own to help build interest in the season months ahead of time, even without much other context or promotion surrounding it yet. Beyond the literal head and body conflict borrowed from the title's source material, the episode carries a second layer worth pulling apart separately, one that has nothing to do with Eraserhead at all, and everything to do with the show poking fun at itself and the company that actually owns it. Rick and Morty airs on a network that sits underneath a much larger media company, the same company that owns and distributes a large amount of other film and television content across the entire industry. Shows that have run for as many seasons as this one has occasionally reach a point where the writers start finding ways to joke about their own situation directly, acknowledging out loud, even briefly, that the show exists inside a much bigger corporate structure, controlling what does and does not make it to air. Eric Head includes a moment built specifically around this kind of self-aware humor, folding a joke about the studio's own ownership of the show directly into the episode itself, rather than keeping that kind of commentary confined to interviews or behind-the-scenes discussion where audiences would never actually see it. This is not the first time this show has been willing to point at its own existence and laugh about it. Across many earlier seasons, the show has occasionally broken away from its usual story to comment on its own production, sometimes joking about executives, sometimes joking about the pressure of keeping a long-running series going, and sometimes joking about the very specific position it holds as an adult animated show airing on a late-night block built around that kind of programming. Folding a joke about the studio's ownership into an episode already built around a man's head coming apart from his body adds a second kind of split happening inside the same half hour, one physical and obvious, playing out directly in the animation, and one much quieter, aimed at the audience members who understand how the entertainment industry actually works behind the curtain. Jokes like this tend to land in two very different ways depending on who is watching. A viewer who has no interest in how television gets made, who films end up made, and which one studio owns, will still get a complete, satisfying episode out of Eric Head just from watching Rick's head and body fight each other across the runtime. The joke about corporate ownership sits quietly underneath that story, without needing to be understood at all for the episode to work as a piece of comedy on its own. But a viewer who does pay attention to those kinds of behind-the-scenes details, who follows industry news or knows which company owns which network, gets an entirely separate joke handed to them, one built specifically to reward paying attention to something outside the actual plot of the episode itself. This layered approach, one joke sitting on the surface and another sitting underneath it, aimed at a smaller, more informed slice of the audience, has become something of a signature for this show across its many seasons. Long-running adult animated comedies tend to develop this kind of double structure naturally over time, since a portion of their audience has been watching long enough and closely enough to notice patterns and self-references that a brand new viewer picking up the show for the first time would have no way of catching. Eric Head simply continues that tradition, using its own title, borrowed from a decades-old surrealist film, as an excuse to build an episode with exactly that same kind of split, one obvious and physical, the other buried and aimed squarely at people who already understand the business side of how a show like this one actually gets made and released. Looking at where Eric Head sits inside the full run of 10 episodes this season also says something about how the season was structured overall. Sitting at the 6th spot out of 10, it lands almost exactly in the middle of the season, past the opening stretch built around resolving evil Morty's blackmail plot and Rick's disappearance as Ted, but well before the season starts winding down toward its final episodes. Episodes positioned in the middle of a season often carry a different kind of weight compared to premieres and finales. They do not need to open big storylines or close them out, which frequently gives them more freedom to try something strange stranger or more experimental, since there is less pressure riding on them to move the season's larger plot forward in any specific direction. A concept as visually unusual as a man's head detaching completely from his body and fighting it fits comfortably into that kind of mid-season slot, where the show has more room to indulge in a stranger, more self-contained idea without needing to worry as much about setting up or resolving anything connected to the season's bigger picture. The choice to feature this particular image on an official season poster released back in April, well ahead of the episode's actual air date, also says something about how confident the people marketing the season were in this specific visual moment landing well with audiences. Posters built to represent an entire season usually get built around images the marketing team believes will grab attention quickly, images strange or striking enough to make someone stop scrolling and take a closer look. Choosing to include Rick fighting his own detached head as one of only 3 images representing 10 full episodes worth of story suggests this was seen internally as one of the stronger, more visually memorable moments the season had to offer, strong enough to help sell the entire season on its own before a single new episode had actually aired for anyone to watch. None of this requires deep knowledge of Eraserhead itself to appreciate on a basic level. Someone who has never seen David Lynch's original film and knows nothing about its history can still watch Eraserhead and understand exactly what is happening on screen, watching Rick's head and body clash with each other in a fight built for laughs rather than horror. But understanding where the title actually comes from, recognizing the specific kind of unsettling head imagery the original film became known for, and connecting that history to the very literal way this episode turns that same idea into its central plot adds a layer of appreciation that only shows up once someone goes looking for where the joke actually started. Combined with the quieter studio ownership gag folded in underneath everything else, Eraserhead ends up carrying 2 separate types of buried meaning stacked on top of a plot that plays as pure, simple, physical comedy on its surface. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same kind of buried meaning shows up again 2 episodes later, though the tone shifts dramatically once it does, because a single insult thrown during a moment of pure body horror chaos turns out to be quietly reaching back into one of the darkest pieces of backstory this entire show has ever built. Section 6, a death reference buried in an insult. 2 episodes after Eraserhead, the season reaches its 8th episode, titled Requiem Mort a Dream. The title borrows directly from Requiem for a Dream, a well-known film from 2000 about several characters whose lives spiral downward through addiction, following the same basic wordplay formula this show has used across nearly every season it has produced. Slide the word mort into the middle of an existing title everyone already recognizes, and the joke writes itself. This particular episode aired on July the 12th, placing it near the very end of the season, only 2 episodes away from the finale. The plot centers on Morty wanting something fairly ordinary for a kid his age. He wants Rick to get him a pack of Pokemon cards, referencing the long-running trading card game and media franchise most people recognize on sight, even if they have never collected a single card themselves. Rick, being Rick, does not simply hand over money or take Morty to a store like a normal grandfather might. Instead, he offers Morty something stranger. He gives him access to a creature called a sympathid, a strange organism able to generate what the episode treats as unlimited empathy, feeding it directly into whoever holds it. The idea, on paper, sounds almost sweet. Morty is hoping to gain a better understanding of the people around him, to feel more connected to the struggles and feelings of others, rather than staying wrapped up entirely in his own concerns. Rick frames the entire idea using a very specific comparison, describing the effect of the sympathid as something that will gloss over Rick's own actions, the same way a Disney edit smooths over a slasher movie, cutting out anything too disturbing and leaving behind something soft and easy to watch instead. That line alone tells the audience early on that whatever this device actually does, it is not going to stay simple or safe for very long. Just like Rick predicted through that Disney comparison, matters spiral out of control quickly. Morty's newfound flood of empathy does not simply make him kinder or more understanding in a normal, manageable way. It grows into something far more overwhelming, eventually reaching a point where Morty's own empathy centers, the actual parts of him responsible for generating this flood of feeling, start getting consumed entirely by whatever process the sympathid has triggered inside him. In the middle of this chaos, while clearly not thinking straight anymore, Morty turns on Rick and hurls an insult his way, calling him a specific and deeply personal name tied directly to something Rick has been carrying since existence long before this season, and long before this entire show even began in the form fans know it today. The insult calls Rick a dumb, dead, wife-having person, using much rougher language than that in the actual episode itself, but the meaning underneath it points straight at one of the most important pieces of backstory this show has ever built. Rick's wife, a woman named Diane, was murdered years before the events of the show even begin, and her death sits at the very center of Rick's entire personality and motivation across the whole series. The show slowly revealed the full details of what happened to Diane across multiple seasons, using flashbacks scattered throughout different episodes, rather than dumping the entire story out all at once. Those flashbacks showed that Diane was killed by a version of Rick from another reality, a version who eventually became known to fans and to the show itself as Rick Prime, one of the most dangerous and important villains this entire series has ever introduced. Rick Prime did not simply kill Diane in one single reality either. He killed her across every single version of reality where she existed, wiping her out completely and permanently, leaving Rick C-137, the specific Rick the show follows as its main character, as one of the only versions of Rick anywhere who lost his wife this way and still carries the memory of who she actually was. That backstory did not stay buried in a single flashback episode either. It grew into one of the show's largest and most serious storylines, eventually building toward a direct hunt for Rick Prime himself, stretching across an entire season built specifically around Rick finally tracking down the man responsible for Diane's death and confronting him directly. That storyline gave the show some of its most emotionally heavy material to date, treating Diane's murder not as a throwaway piece of backstory used once and then forgotten, but as a wound that shaped nearly everything about who Rick is and why he behaves the way he does, across every other episode surrounding it. Given how much weight that storyline carries, having Morty throw a direct reference to it into the middle of a completely unrelated, chaotic body horror plot about empathy creatures and trading cards says something specific about how this show handles its own darkest material. The insult is not delivered slowly, with the camera lingering on Rick's face while music swells underneath to signal that something important just happened. It is thrown out quickly, almost buried inside a stream of other chaotic dialogue happening at the same time, the kind of line that could easily slip past someone watching casually while distracted or half paying attention. There is no pause afterward. The episode does not stop to let the moment breathe. It simply keeps moving forward into the next beat of the sympathid crisis as if nothing especially heavy had just been said out loud. This approach fits a pattern this show has used again and again across many seasons. Rather than treating Diane's death as something precious that needs to be handled delicately every single time it comes up, the show frequently lets that same backstory get dragged into completely unrelated jokes, insults, and chaotic asides scattered throughout otherwise unconnected episodes. It is a specific kind of writing choice, one that trusts the audience to already understand the full weight sitting behind a reference like this without needing it spelled out again every single time it appears. Someone who has never watched the seasons covering Rick Prime and Diane's full backstory would likely hear this insult and register it as nothing more than a rough, generic jab meant to wound Rick in the moment. Nothing more specific than that. Someone who has followed that entire storyline closely, though, hears something completely different. A direct reference landing right in the middle of Morty's own empathy meltdown, made all the more uncomfortable by the fact that Morty is supposedly overflowing with understanding and compassion for others at the exact moment he throws out one of the cruelest possible things he could say to his own grandfather. There is a kind of irony sitting underneath that timing worth pulling apart on its own. The entire point of the sympathid was to make Morty more empathetic, more capable of understanding pain and feeling connected to the people around him. And yet, the moment that empathy overwhelms him completely, rather than making him gentler or kinder toward Rick, it produces the exact opposite result, pushing him toward the single most painful thing he could possibly say about his grandfather's past. Whether the writers intended that specific irony, or whether it emerged naturally out of the chaos the sympathid plot demanded, is not something publicly confirmed. But the contrast between what the device was supposed to do and what actually comes out of Morty's mouth in that moment lines up closely enough that it seems unlikely to be a complete accident. The rest of the episode carries its own separate storyline running alongside Morty's meltdown, following Summer and Jerry on what starts out as a simple errand run. Rick sends the two of them out to buy items from his shopping list, and what should have been an ordinary trip to the store turns into something much more dangerous once they end up crossing paths with an actual serial killer during the outing. The episode places a specific detail inside this side plot that connects it to true crime history sitting completely outside the show's own fictional
fictional universe. A photograph inside the killer's house shows a real historical figure connected to serial murder, tying a fictional character's background directly to an actual name from true crime history, rather than inventing something entirely made up for the joke. This kind of detail, slipping a real-world reference into the visual background of a scene rather than stating it out loud through dialogue, matches the same buried, easy-to-miss style used throughout most of this episode's other details. That side plot also carries its own smaller references worth noting. At one point, Rick specifically identifies his American Express card by its shortened nickname, Amex, while explaining to Jerry that the card will automatically block any purchase Jerry tries to make with it, a small joke built around Rick's total lack of trust in Jerry's spending habits, even during something as simple as a shopping errand. And the specific store Jerry and Summer visit to complete this shopping list is a real-world retail chain, Home Depot, grounding this otherwise chaotic episode in a familiar, ordinary location before the serial killer plot takes over and pulls the story somewhere much darker. Elsewhere in the episode, Rick and Morty end up competing on a version of the television competition show Dancing with the Stars, aiming to win something called a Grimaldian potato as their prize. During their performance, the music playing underneath their dance is a specific, arranged version of Clair de Lune, a well-known piano piece by composer Claude Debussy, though the specific version used in this scene is the one created for the trailer of the 2019 film Godzilla, King of the Monsters, rather than the original classical recording. Choosing a modified trailer version of a decades-old piece of classical music, one already reused once before for a giant monster film trailer, adds one more small, layered reference sitting inside an episode already packed full of them, tucked into a scene that most viewers would likely register simply as a funny dance number, rather than something built from several separate, specific outside sources. A quieter detail connects this episode back to something the show established several seasons earlier. While trying to get Rick's attention during his own personal crisis, Morty is shown wearing a specific set of pajamas, the exact same pajamas he wore during an earlier season episode called Night Family, an episode where a version of Morty, referred to as Night Morty, temporarily took control of his body while he slept. Reusing that specific clothing detail, rather than putting Morty in generic pajamas for this scene, ties this episode back to that earlier storyline in a way that adds nothing to the actual plot, but rewards someone who happens to remember exactly what Morty was wearing several seasons earlier. Rick himself gets a brief personal detour during the episode as well, stepping away from the chaos happening elsewhere in the house to visit his own private brewery, located on one of the lower levels inside his laboratory. This is where he keeps equipment specifically built for what the show refers to as his liquor science, using it to relax, unwind, and produce more alcohol for his personal drinking flask. Giving Rick his own quiet, separate space completely removed from Morty's sympathid crisis and Summer and Jerry's serial killer encounter adds a small breathing moment inside an otherwise busy episode juggling two separate chaotic storylines happening at the same time. The episode's post-credits scene extends Morty's empathy storyline slightly further than the main episode does on its own. It shows an extended version of Morty attempting to display empathy toward a teacher at his school, only for the teacher to turn around and accuse him of being insensitive about her own problems, flipping the entire premise of the sympathid on its head one more time before the episode fully ends. Even once Morty's meltdown during the main story has passed, the show still finds one more way to show his newfound empathy backfiring on him in a completely different setting, reinforcing the same idea the earlier insult toward Rick already suggested, that this particular gift never actually worked the way it was supposed to from the very beginning. This episode also happened to premiere during a specific promotional moment for the wider universe surrounding this show. During its original broadcast, a promotional commercial for the separate spin-off project centered on President Curtis, featuring Summer and Beth, aired publicly for the first time, tying this particular episode's air date directly to the promotional rollout for that expanding universe. Placing that specific promotional spot during this exact episode, rather than any other episode in the season, connects Requiem Morta Dream to the franchise's larger plans in a small way that has nothing to do with the actual story happening inside the episode itself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Taken as a whole, Requiem Morta Dream packs an unusual amount of buried material into a single half hour, from a quick reference to Rick's heaviest backstory to a real serial killer's name tucked into a background photograph. All of it sits underneath a plot that, on its surface, is simply a story about a boy who wanted Pokemon cards. That same card pack connects to something else buried in this same episode, a background prop tied
tied to an entirely separate storyline from several episodes earlier, worth pulling apart completely on its own. Section 7. The Pokemon Callback, spanning 2 episodes. The Pokemon card pack sitting in Morty's hands during Requiem Mort a Dream looks like a completely ordinary prop the moment it appears on screen. A kid wants a pack of trading cards featuring a made-up little creature printed on the front, and Rick, being Rick, turns that simple request into an excuse to hand Morty something far stranger than a toy from a store. Most viewers would look at that card pack for maybe 2 seconds before moving on with the rest of the episode. But the specific creature printed on that pack is not a brand new design made up just for this one scene. It is the exact same monster Rick had trapped and used against a completely different problem 2 full seasons earlier in an episode called Mort Ragnarok.
To understand why that card pack matters at all, it helps to go back and look at what actually happened in that earlier episode first, since it lays the groundwork for everything this small detail in Season 9 is quietly building on top of. Ragnarok aired back in December of 2023, landing as the 9th episode of the show's 7th season, and the 70th episode of the series overall. It was written by Jeremy Guilford and Scott Martyr, the same Scott Martyr who continues serving as the showrunner for the series today, and it was directed by Kyung-hee Lim. The episode opens with a strange, misleading scene. Jerry finds himself standing in front of a bright, glowing light, greeted by his own late grandmother, only for her to seem annoyed that this has apparently already happened before. Jerry gets pulled right back out of whatever afterlife he had briefly wandered into, and the show reveals that this entire moment was not some kind of mystical accident.
Rick had actually been killing Jerry over and over again on purpose, using each short death as a way to test whether some kind of afterlife genuinely existed on the other side. Once Rick confirms that an afterlife is real, his mind jumps immediately to a much bigger idea. If an actual afterlife exists somewhere, then whatever power or energy runs that place must be enormous, since it apparently has enough room and resources to hold every person who has ever died across all of human history. Rick decides he wants to tap directly into that energy source for his own personal use, treating something most people would consider a sacred, unknowable mystery as nothing more than an untapped power supply waiting for someone smart enough to plug into it. This is a very familiar kind of motivation for Rick across the show's history. He has repeatedly treated enormous, terrifying concepts, things like death, the afterlife, and the structure of entire universes as engineering problems rather than things to be feared or respected the way most people would treat them. To reach the specific kind of afterlife he wants, Rick decides he needs to die the way a warrior would, since the version of the afterlife he is targeting is Valhalla, the Norse mythological hall reserved specifically for warriors who die honorably in battle. Getting into Valhalla the right way means Rick needs to actually die a warrior's death himself, which creates an obvious problem, since dying that way on purpose is not exactly something someone can simply schedule and plan out neatly on their own. This is where the Pokeball first becomes important to the plot. Rick already has Bigfoot, the legendary cryptid, trapped inside one of these devices before the episode even properly begins. He has been holding Bigfoot captive purely so he can use him later as a tool, fully aware that releasing an angry, humiliated Bigfoot directly at himself would guarantee a violent and, by Rick's twisted logic, appropriately warrior-like death. The plan works exactly as cruelly as Rick intended. Once released from the Pokeball, Bigfoot, furious after having been trapped and mistreated, kills Rick in a brutal, direct way, sending Rick's soul off to Valhalla just as he had hoped. From there, the episode follows Rick getting killed again almost immediately once he actually arrives in Valhalla, since the entire hall is filled with real Viking warriors who spend their eternity locked in constant, repeated battle against each other. Rick gets reborn again inside a tavern located within Valhalla itself, and from there begins working out how the entire system actually functions, eventually sneaking into a blacksmith's warehouse and knocking out a worker so he can steal the materials he needs to build some kind of energy relay connecting Valhalla back to the normal world. Back on Earth, Morty watches Bigfoot bury Rick's body and pray for forgiveness afterward, genuinely regretting what he was pushed into doing. Morty, feeling sympathetic toward Bigfoot rather than angry at him, tries to comfort him, only to get killed himself in the process and end up pulled into Valhalla completely against his own will. From there, the episode escalates into an increasingly chaotic back and forth. Bigfoot ends up recruited by the Pope himself, joining forces with the Vatican as a kind of personal enforcer, a plot direction the episode plays almost like a loose parody of Van Helsing, the film about a warrior fighting monsters on behalf of the Catholic Church. The Pope eventually reveals he has found a way to tap into the same infinite energy source Rick was originally after, and uses that stolen power to kill Rick, Morty, and Bigfoot outright, sending all three of them straight back to Valhalla since they remain tied to the relay system Rick had built earlier. What follows is a repeating cycle of death and rebirth, with Rick, Morty, and Bigfoot dying again and again as they try different approaches to stopping the Pope, none of which managed to work on the first several attempts. At one point, they even bring in a group of monsters loosely based on the classic Universal Monsters lineup, including versions clearly modeled after Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Wolfman, the Gill Man, and the Mummy, all of them coming in to help fight the Pope's forces, only to end up killed themselves and pulled into Valhalla right alongside everyone else. Eventually, after enough failed attempts, the trio does manage to overpower the Pope for good, and Rick, in one final moment of pure comedic cruelty, captures the Pope himself inside another Pokeball, immediately calling it a Pope Ball out loud, and insisting he was only saying the obvious joke everyone would have made anyway before anyone else could beat him to it. The episode closes with Rick and Morty finally releasing Bigfoot back into the woods where he belongs, in a scene the show plays specifically as a direct nod to Harry and the Hendersons, the film about a gentle, misunderstood Bigfoot figure living peacefully among humans. And in the post-credit scene, Rick is shown fighting in an underground battling ring against a character clearly modeled after Ash Ketchum, the well-known main trainer character from the actual Pokemon franchise, sending the Pope himself out to battle as though he were just another creature to be used in combat, right up until the entire ring gets raided by federal agents and the scene cuts off before the fight can properly continue. Throughout the whole episode, Rick refers to the device holding Bigfoot and the Pope directly as a Pokeball, despite the show using a different color scheme than the actual toy line from the real Pokemon franchise, keeping the joke clearly recognizable without directly copying the real product's specific design. This was not the first time the show had ever nodded toward Pokemon either. A background object resembling one of these devices had appeared briefly years earlier sitting inside a character's office in a much earlier season episode, and a different earlier episode had shown Space Beth using one of these same devices to summon a creature during a fight against Rick, who defended himself by sending out a creature of his own in response, turning a single scene into a quick battle between the two of them. Beyond the show itself, this style of Pokemon parody carries over into an actual video game the franchise produced separately, a game built around collecting different versions of Morty using devices called Morty Manipulator Chips, rather than anything called a Pokeball directly, showing that this particular joke had already been developed enough to support its own separate game built entirely around the concept. One small piece of dialogue inside Mort Ragnarok reveals something specific about how being trapped inside one of these devices actually works within the show's own version of the joke. The Pope, once finally released from captivity, mentions that he completely lost track of time while trapped inside the device, admitting he was not even sure what year it currently was once he came back out. Enough time had passed while he was gone that an entirely new Pope had already been elected to take his place, meaning the character spent long enough trapped inside that single device for the entire structure of the Vatican's leadership to change without him. Now, back to the actual detail connecting all of this directly to Season 9. The creature printed on the front of Morty's Pokemon card packs in Requiem Mort A Dream is the same monster Rick had trapped inside one of these devices back during the events of Mort Ragnarok. Seeing that exact creature reappear, printed onto a completely mundane piece of packaging for a kid's trading card game 2 full seasons later, is the kind of detail that adds absolutely nothing to the actual plot of the newer episode. Morty wanting Pokemon cards works exactly the same whether or not that specific creature happens to match anything from an earlier season. Nobody in the scene points out the connection out loud. No character reacts to it or mentions where that creature actually came from. It sits there silently on a piece of background art, doing nothing except quietly rewarding anyone who happens to recognize it from 2 seasons earlier. This kind of small, silent continuity choice fits a much larger pattern this show has followed since its very first season. Rather than treating every single episode as a fully separate, discomposable adventure with no lasting connection to anything that happened before it, the show has consistently built a version of its own universe where creatures, objects, and background details from past episodes are allowed to quietly resurface later, sometimes years afterward, without any dialogue drawing attention to
it. Fans who track this kind of continuity closely often refer to these details as background rewards, small pieces of evidence proving that the people writing and drawing this show are paying attention to their own history rather than starting fresh with every new episode. There is something specifically fitting about this particular creature being the one chosen to reappear this way. Ragnarok was, at its core, an episode about Rick treating something enormous and mysterious, the actual concept of an afterlife, as nothing more than a resource to exploit for his own convenience. He turned death itself into an engineering problem, using a device originally built for capturing small creatures in a children's card game to instead trap and control Bigfoot, and later, the literal head of the Catholic Church. Having that exact same creature reappear years later on the packaging of an actual children's card game inside a different episode closes a strange little loop on its own, taking a device built as a parody of a kid's toy and eventually landing that same creature back onto an actual piece of kids' toy packaging within the show's own fictional world. Whether that specific irony was intentional on the part of whoever designed this background prop for Requiem Mort a Dream is not something publicly confirmed, but the shape of it lines up closely enough to be worth noticing regardless. It is also worth remembering how heavily focused on Pokemon references Mort Ragnarok was in the first place, since it stands out as one of the most concentrated uses of that particular parody the show had ever attempted up to that point. The episode did not simply drop in one quick joke about a Pokeball and move on. It built an entire post-credit scene around a full parody battle sequence, complete with a trainer character modeled directly after one of the most recognizable figures in the entire Pokemon franchise. Given how much attention that single episode dedicated to building out its own version of this joke, it makes sense that whoever worked on Requiem Mort a Dream years later might have wanted to reach back and specifically reuse an image tied to that same episode, rather than inventing a completely new, unconnected creature design purely for a background card pack nobody would look at twice. A few other small references tucked inside Mort Ragnarok are worth mentioning briefly as well, since they show the same layered approach to outside references that keep showing up throughout this show's history. At one point, Rick makes a joke comparing the Norse god Odin to Spider-Man's uncle, a reference that sounds like a completely made-up, absurd comparison on the surface, but is actually based on a real comic book story published decades earlier. In a 1982 issue of a series called What If, Marvel published a single panel imagining an alternate universe where Odin takes the place of Ben Parker, the character better known as Spider-Man's Uncle Ben. Slipping a reference that specific and that obscure into a single throwaway joke shows the same kind of layered writing approach the show uses constantly. Jokes that work perfectly fine on their own for someone with no idea where they came from, while rewarding a much smaller audience who happens to recognize the exact, specific source being referenced underneath the surface. None of this changes how either episode actually plays out from start to finish. Mort Ragnarok works completely fine as its own self-contained, chaotic adventure about Rick trying to mine the afterlife for energy and accidentally getting stuck in an ongoing battle against the Pope. Requiem Mort a Dream works completely fine as its own story about Morty gaining too much empathy from a strange creature Rick gives him. Neither episode needs the other to make sense on its own terms, but sitting the two side by side reveals a small, quiet thread connecting them anyway, one built entirely out of a single piece of background art reused 2 full seasons apart, tying a story about mining death itself for personal gain to a completely unrelated story about a kid simply wanting a pack of trading cards. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same kind of quiet, long-term planning behind small details points towards something much bigger sitting just outside these 10 episodes entirely, since the promotional commercial that aired during this very episode's original broadcast was not advertising anything happening inside the show itself, but rather a brand new project expanding this entire universe even further. Section 8. The franchise is expanding past the flagship show. Requiem Mort a Dream did more than tell a story about Pokemon cards and a creature that gives away too much empathy. Airing on July the 12th, it also carried a promotional commercial during its original broadcast, one that had nothing to do with the plot of that episode and everything to do with a much bigger plan sitting behind the entire 9th season. That commercial was advertising a brand new series called President Curtis, and understanding where that show actually came from means going back to a character who has been quietly appearing in this universe for over a decade already. President Andre Curtis is not a new invention built specifically for this spinoff. The character first showed up in the show's 2nd season, in an episode called Get Schwifty, created by Wes Archer and Tom Kaufman, as a stand-in for the sitting president of the United States at that time. He did not even have a surname yet when he first appeared. That came later, arriving during the show's 5th season, once the character had already stuck around long enough to become a genuine fan favorite. Keith David has voiced the role from the very beginning, and his booming, commanding voice performance became one of the more memorable side elements of any episode he appeared in, largely because the character was written as someone trying to hold on to some shred of presidential dignity while getting dragged into whatever chaos Rick had caused that week. Keith David's own career stretches back decades before he ever took on this role, with a long list of film and television credits built on exactly the kind of deep, commanding voice that made him an obvious choice for playing a fictional president in the first place. And that same voice is what carries directly over into his lead role on this new spin-off. The character's original design carries an extra layer of meaning worth noting on its own. Because Get Swifty aired during a specific real-world presidential term, the character was clearly built as a lighthearted, exaggerated version of the actual sitting president at that time. Something the show never stated outright, but that was fairly obvious from the way the character looked and carried himself in his first appearance. Over the years, as the show continued and real-world politics moved on, President Curtis stopped functioning as a direct stand-in for any specific real person, and instead grew into his own fully separate character, one whose backstory and personality became entirely the show's own invention rather than tied to whoever happened to be running the country at any given moment. That evolution, from a quick topical joke into a character stable enough to eventually support his own separate series, says something about how much room this show has always given its smaller side characters to grow well beyond their original purpose. The spin-off itself was first announced back on July the 25th of 2025 during the panel for the flagship show's 8th season at San Diego Comic-Con. Keith David made a surprise appearance at that panel to help confirm the news himself, revealing that he would be reprising his role as President Curtis for an entire series built around the character. Two other performers were confirmed to join him at that same announcement, Stephanie Beatriz and Jim Rash, both signed on as series regulars. Dan Harmon, who co-created the flagship show and continues serving as an executive producer on it, is also credited as a co-creator on this new spin-off, working alongside James Siciliano, another longtime executive producer from the original series. Three additional producers, Danielle Ulrich, Monica Mitchell, and Steve Levy, round out the team behind the project. A few days after that initial announcement, on July the 29th of 2025, a separate animation studio called Lighthouse Studios revealed publicly that they were the ones actually handling the animation work for the new series. Then, in February of 2026, Keith David gave an interview confirming that the show was being planned for a release sometime later that same year, though no exact date had been locked in yet at that point. The following month, in March of 2026, two separate pieces of news arrived on the very same day. California's state government announced it was giving President Curtis a tax credit, making it one of the very first animated shows to receive that specific kind of financial support, alongside a similar spin-off connected to a different long-running animated comedy, a series centered on a character called Stewie, tied to Family Guy. Tax credits like this one are typically offered by state governments to encourage productions to base their work locally rather than moving that work somewhere cheaper. And seeing two separate animated spin-offs from two completely different long-running comedies receive this kind of credit around the same time suggests state officials were treating animated spin-off projects as a growing, worthwhile category to support financially, rather than a niche or minor part of the television industry. And on that same day in March, it was also revealed that the network had already renewed President Curtis for a second season, doing so before the first season had even premiered for anyone to watch, a level of confidence in an unreleased show that is fairly rare across the television industry as a whole. Details about what the actual show would look like started arriving in June of 2026. On the 23rd of that month, the president of the network responsible for airing the series spoke publicly about the show for the first time in real detail, describing it as a workplace comedy and explaining that the level of technology available to President Curtis and his staff would be noticeably different and far less advanced than the kind of technology Rick builds and uses constantly on the flagship series. This detail matters because it draws a clear line between the two shows in terms of tone. Rick and Morty leans heavily on wild, reality-bending science fiction technology as a core part of its identity. President Curtis, by contrast, appears to be leaning more toward a grounded workplace comedy structure, one where the humor comes from office politics and staff dynamics colliding with occasional strange, unexplained events, rather than from portal guns and interdimensional travel happening every single episode. Some early coverage
coverage of the series compared its tone to The X-Files, the long-running television series about government agents investigating unexplained and paranormal cases, suggesting President Curtis may lean toward that same kind of mystery-driven structure while still keeping its own distinct sense of humor running underneath it. One day after that, on June the 24th, the network officially confirmed the premiere date and released the first full trailer for the series. That trailer aired publicly for the first time during the broadcast of the Eric Head episode, meaning fans watching Rick's head and body fight each other on screen also got their very first proper look at what this new spin-off was actually going to be. The same day, the first episode of President Curtis was given an early preview screening at the Annecy International Animation Film Festival, a major animation-focused event held in France, letting industry professionals and attendees see the premiere episode before the general public got any access to it at all. The network's own president spoke about choosing that specific festival as the venue for the show's first public screening, stating plainly that there is no better crowd of animation lovers anywhere than the one gathered at that particular event, calling it the perfect place to introduce a brand new series to the kind of audience most likely to appreciate it properly. Both Dan Harmon and James Siciliano attended that screening in person alongside Keith David, giving the premiere episode an in-person presentation from the people who actually created it, rather than simply releasing it quietly online with no fanfare. The trailer itself gave audiences their first real look at what kind of humor the show intended to run on. One moment shown in the trailer features a young boy asking President Curtis directly whether he is the boy's father, only for Curtis to respond firmly that he is not, while also throwing in a joking reference to the well-known Michael Jackson song Billie Jean, a song built around a similar kind of paternity denial, and adding a blunt comment about keeping himself protected to avoid that exact situation happening for real. Another detail revealed through the trailer shows President Curtis getting the chance to drive a car resembling Kit, the talking, artificially intelligent vehicle from the classic television series Knight Rider, treated in the trailer as one of the small perks that comes with holding the highest office in the country inside this particular fictional universe. The show's official description lays out its basic premise clearly. It follows President Andre Curtis and his staff as they handle the kinds of strange, unusual crises that Rick Sanchez would never bother dealing with himself, ranging from interdimensional diplomacy to paranormal investigations and other unexplained phenomena. Stephanie Beatriz plays a character named Chief of Staff Banks, described as a strict, by-the-book presence working closely alongside the president. Beatriz built a wide following through her earlier work on the police comedy series Brooklyn Nine-Nine, along with more recent voice work on an animated series called Twisted Metal, giving her an existing audience already familiar with her comedic timing before she ever took on this new role. Jim Rash plays a character called Special Agent O'Doyle, described in a noticeably different tone as more of a rebellious, rule-breaking figure. Rash is widely known for his work on the ensemble comedy series Community, another long-running show built around a tight group of mismatched characters working through absurd situations together, a background that lines up naturally with the kind of workplace ensemble comedy President Curtis appears to be aiming for. Two additional performers, Dan Bacadal and Kelsey Scott, were also confirmed as part of the cast, though their specific roles have not been publicly detailed in the same way as the other two. Interestingly, Jim Rash already has a small existing connection to the flagship show beyond this new spin-off. He previously provided a guest voice for a character named Glaxo Slim Slom in an earlier episode of the original series, meaning his involvement in this universe technically predates his casting in President Curtis itself. President Curtis is not the very first spin-off this franchise has produced either. It follows two earlier ones, a project called Vindicators 2 and a separate series called Rick and Morty the Anime, making this the third time the flagship show's universe has been expanded into a separate, standalone project rather than staying contained entirely within the original series. That pattern on its own says something about how the people running this franchise have started thinking about its future, treating the main show less like a single self-contained story and more like the foundation for a much wider universe capable of supporting multiple separate shows at once. Each of these earlier spin-offs took a different approach to expanding the universe, with one focused on a parody superhero team already established inside the flagship series, and the other reimagining the core concept of the show through a completely different visual and animation style tied to a different country's animation industry. President Curtis takes yet another approach again, pulling a single side character out of the flagship show entirely and building an original workplace comedy premise around him, rather than simply retelling stories that already exist inside the original series. The scheduling chosen for President Curtis makes its connection to the flagship series impossible to miss. The premiere episode is set to air directly after the Season 9 finale of Rick and Morty, going up at 11:30 at night on July the 26th, immediately following the finale's 11 o'clock time slot on the very same night. Every new episode released after that point will then become available to stream the following day. Lining up the premiere this closely, immediately following the flagship show's own finale rather than debuting on some unrelated night weeks later, gives the new spin-off the strongest possible lead-in audience it could hope for, capturing viewers who are already tuned in and watching right as the credits roll on the season they just finished. The network's own president spoke directly about why this particular spin-off was chosen, framing it as something that could stand entirely on its own merits, regardless of its connection to the flagship show. He specifically stated that the series would have been greenlit even without any tie to Rick and Morty at all, arguing that the character of President Curtis alone was strong enough to justify carrying an entire show by himself, and that the surrounding world built out for this new series works as a complete standalone experience rather than simply riding on the coattails of a more established property. He went further, saying he could not wait for audiences to see just how well President Curtis works entirely on its own terms once the series actually premieres, framing the flagship show's connection to it as a helpful bonus for viewers rather than something the new series would need to lean on in order to succeed. Looking at this spin-off alongside everything else happening around it puts Season 9's release into a slightly different light. This was never simply one season of one show airing on its own. It sat inside a much bigger structure, one where a long-term, multi-season renewal locked the flagship series in through a 12th season, where a separate spin-off had already been renewed for its own second season before its first had even aired, where a second animated spin-off from an entirely different comedy franchise was receiving the exact same kind of state tax support around the same time, and where the two Rick and Morty universe shows were deliberately scheduled back-to-back on the exact same night to hand one audience directly over to the other. Season 9 functioned as much as a launching pad for what comes next as it did a standalone chapter of the story it has been telling since it began. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That kind of long-term thinking behind the scenes connects directly to something the person running the flagship show has spoken about publicly as well, this time concerning a much less flashy topic than a new spin-off series: the actual gap between when episodes air on television and when they finally show up for people watching through streaming instead. Section 9. Showrunner statements on production and the streaming delay. Everything covered so far in this rundown has come from watching the actual episodes closely, or from paying attention to trailers, posters, and clips released ahead of time. This next piece comes from somewhere different entirely, from interviews where the people actually running the show sat down and talked openly about how Season 9 came together behind the scenes, and about a long-running complaint from fans that finally started changing this year. To understand why Season 9 took as long as it did to reach the screen, it helps to go back to 2018 first. On May the 10th of that year, the network ordered 70 additional episodes of the show as part of a long-term deal with the two co-creators, a deal that guaranteed the series a future stretching far beyond whatever season happened to be airing at the time. Season 9 falls inside that same 70-episode order, meaning the groundwork for this exact season had technically been laid years before a single script for it existed. Deals of that size are rare in television generally, since most shows get renewed one season at a time, with no guarantee of anything beyond whatever batch of episodes is currently airing. Locking in 70 future episodes all at once gave this particular show a level of long-term security that very few other series, animated or otherwise, have ever been given by a network. Work on Season 9 ran into a serious delay in 2023. On June the 14th of that year, the president of the network responsible for the show, along with one of its executive producers, publicly confirmed that Season 9 had already been partly written, but that work on it had been paused because of the Writers Guild of America strike happening across the entire television and film industry that year. Strikes like this one happen when writers walk off the job as a form of protest, usually over pay, working conditions, or other contract disputes with the studios that employ them. And when a strike like that happens, any show still in the writing process simply has to stop and wait until the strike ends before continuing. The strike itself turned out to be one of the longest labor disputes in the history of the union representing these writers. It officially began at 1 minute past midnight on May the 2nd, 2023, and did not end until 12:01 in the morning on September the 27th of that same year, lasting a total of 148 days.
days from start to finish. That length made it the second longest strike the writers' union had ever carried out, trailing only a strike from 1988 that ran for 153 days. Roughly 11,500 screenwriters were represented by the union during the dispute, all of them walking off their jobs at the same time, refusing to write, pitch new ideas, sell scripts, take meetings, or respond to notes on any existing projects until a new contract could be agreed upon. Partway through that same summer, a separate union representing actors joined the writers in striking as well, creating a situation the news media at the time referred to as a double strike, since it marked only the second time in history that two major Hollywood unions had walked out together at the exact same time, the first having happened decades earlier in 1960. Negotiations between the writers' union and the group representing major studios moved slowly for most of that summer. The two sides met on August the 4th without reaching any agreement, then agreed 10 days later to resume formal negotiations, with the union later telling its members that the studios had shown some willingness to compromise on certain issues, including protections against the growing use of automated writing tools, while remaining unwilling to budge on other demands entirely. Real movement did not happen until deep into September. Between September the 20th and the 24th, top executives from several major studios and streaming companies, including the head of the company that owns the network responsible for this exact show, sat down directly with the union's negotiating committee for the first time. That round of meetings produced a tentative agreement, and by September the 27th, Guild leadership had voted to officially lift the restrictions and allow writers back to work, even while the full contract still needed to be formally approved by the union's members through a separate ratification vote. When that vote eventually happened, 99% of the union's members voted in favor of accepting the new agreement, showing just how united the workforce had remained across nearly 5 months of striking. Season 9 sat frozen in exactly that gap, partially written but paused, for almost the entire length of that historic labor dispute, only picking back up again once writers were legally cleared to return to their jobs. Once the strike ended, progress moved forward steadily. By May the 12th of 2025, Scott Marder, who has served as the show's showrunner since its 4th season, revealed publicly that Season 9 had reached its final stage of production, describing the episodes as almost entirely into color at that point. Color is one of the last major steps in finishing an animated episode, meaning the season was close to fully complete well over a year before it finally aired. A few months after that, on July the 27th of 2025, it was announced that voice recording work for the season had begun, and by September of that same year, one of the show's other executive producers, Steve Levy, gave further updates on how production was progressing. That timeline shows just how long a single season of a show like this one actually takes to build from start to finish, with writing, animation, coloring, and voice recording all happening across separate, overlapping stretches of time, long before any of it ever reaches a television screen. Scott Marder's role in all of this deserves its own explanation, since his position running the show looks very different from how things worked during the show's earliest years. Before Marder took over, the series was run directly by its two co-creators, Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland. Harmon has described that earlier era of the show using a specific comparison, calling it an auteur-based process, the kind of environment where a small number of creative minds hold total control over every decision, constantly refining and rethinking things without much pressure to lock anything down and move forward. That approach can produce brilliant results, but it can also make a show incredibly slow and unpredictable to actually finish and release on any kind of consistent schedule. Harmon has openly admitted that both he and Roiland had the ability to essentially stop the clock on production whenever they wanted, endlessly polishing and second-guessing decisions, which meant the clock genuinely did stop again and again throughout the show's earlier seasons. He even joked in one interview that he would keep his own coffee resting directly on that particular button if he could, acknowledging just how tempting it always was for him personally to keep hitting pause on a nearly finished episode rather than letting it go out the door. Marder joined the show back during its 4th season, and since then, Harmon credits him directly with turning that chaotic, unpredictable production style into something far steadier and more reliable. Harmon has stated plainly that Marder's presence is the reason deadlines on the show still exist and still get met, describing Marder's job as bailing out what he called a sinking ship, someone whose entire purpose is making sure the show can actually keep producing new episodes instead of getting stuck in an endless loop of rewrites and delays. Harmon has gone further, calling the show's earlier devotion to constant creative reworking its biggest flaw, admitting that without someone someone like Martyr holding the production together, the series likely would have struggled to keep releasing new seasons at any consistent pace at all. Harmon has also described his own current relationship to the show in a slightly different way now that Martyr is steering it, saying he can still give long speeches about wanting to redo entire chunks of a script, and that Martyr will sometimes genuinely agree with him that a change would be an improvement, while still ultimately keeping the production moving forward on schedule regardless. Harmon has framed this dynamic as freeing rather than frustrating, saying it allows him to stay nitpicky about the creative side of the show without personally having to be the one responsible for actually hitting deadlines anymore. This change in leadership lines up with a much bigger shift in the show's production history overall. In January of 2023, the network ended its working relationship with Justin Roiland after he was accused of domestic abuse and, separately, of explicitly communicating with underage girls. That decision reshaped the entire creative team behind the series, and it directly led to Ian Cardoni and Harry Belden stepping in to voice Rick and Morty, starting with the show's 7th season, roles they have continued holding through season 9 as well. Harmon has spoken about wanting the show to keep feeling like itself despite that major change, and Martyr has described the writing team's approach during this stretch as focused on delivering what he calls classic Rick and Morty adventures, while still building out new pieces of the show's larger mythology at the same time. Martyr has also spoken directly about the pressure that comes with running a show that has already been guaranteed years of future episodes. Despite knowing the series has more of a secured future than almost any other show currently on television, Martyr has said the pressure he feels making each season does not actually go down because of that security. He has stated plainly that he feels the exact same pressure whether the show has 2 more seasons left or 5 more, since each individual season still only gets 10 episodes to work with, and he feels responsible for making sure every single one of those 10 episodes is the best it can possibly be, regardless of how much time the show has left overall. He has also expressed genuine surprise at the quality the show has managed to keep delivering this deep into its run, specifically pointing to seasons 8, 9, and 10 as feeling unusually strong for a series that has already produced this many episodes, describing the writing room as still feeling genuinely fresh internally, rather than running out of ideas the way some long-running shows eventually do. Harmon has echoed that same sentiment from his own side, framing the constant presence of deadlines under Martyr's leadership as something closer to a benefit than a burden, arguing that the pressure to create something great is more often an obstacle than a help, and that having firm, unmovable dates on the calendar is part of what actually allows the show to keep producing new material at all. Now, on to the specific issue that fans had been raising for years, and that finally started shifting with this particular season: the long gap between when new episodes actually air on television and when those same episodes finally show up on streaming platforms for anyone without access to live cable. For a long stretch of the show's history, that gap stretched out for months at a time. In prior years, the full season frequently was not available to stream until roughly 6 months after the final episode had already aired on television, meaning fans without access to the actual television broadcast were stuck waiting an extremely long time just to catch up with everyone else. As one specific example, the season that aired the year before season 9 finished its television run in July, but did not actually arrive on streaming platforms until September of that same year, months after anyone watching live had already seen the entire season play out. Martyr addressed this exact issue directly in an interview with the entertainment outlet The Wrap, and his comments on the subject are worth repeating closely, since they show a level of honest frustration that is somewhat rare to hear directly from someone actually running a major television series. Martyr stated plainly that he does not fully understand how the show ended up locked into that particular distribution pattern in the first place, saying the production team has been constantly trying to shrink that gap down. He specifically mentioned hoping the wait might shrink to as little as 3 months for the season being discussed at the time, while admitting openly that he could turn out to be wrong about that estimate. He went further, stating directly that he does not see any real benefit to keeping that long a gap in place, pointing out that most other television shows nowadays make it onto streaming platforms either the very next day after airing, or sometimes even the same day, making the show's own historically long wait look increasingly out of step with how most other television now gets released and consumed. Martyr and Harmon also noted, during that same round of interviews, an interesting pattern they had noticed among the show's own audience, despite the long gap, observing that the most dedicated fans of the show have always tended to watch new episodes the moment they come out, regardless of platform, showing up right away
away rather than waiting for a more convenient streaming release, even when one was available. Season 9 ended up delivering on at least part of that goal. Rather than waiting anywhere near 6 months, new episodes for this specific season began streaming weekly on 2 major platforms starting June the 15th, only a few weeks after the season had already begun airing on cable back in late May. That gap, while still not instant, represents a real, measurable improvement compared to the wait fans had grown used to enduring in earlier years. One entertainment outlet covering the show's release specifically framed this shortened gap as part of a larger pattern happening across the wider media company that owns the network, noting that the same company has been making similar adjustments to shorten exclusivity periods across several other major shows recently, seemingly as part of an effort to keep subscribers more consistently engaged with their streaming service rather than losing them to long stretches with nothing timely to watch. International audiences had already been experiencing something closer to that faster turnaround for a while. Viewers across Europe were able to stream new episodes on the same major platform starting the day immediately following each episode's original American broadcast, a dramatically shorter wait compared to what audiences inside the United States have typically dealt with historically. Seeing international viewers get faster access than domestic ones, especially for a show made and originally broadcast inside the United States, had been a point of frustration among some fans over the years, making the gap between countries feel backwards compared to what viewers might normally expect. Beyond just the streaming timing itself, the show's overall reach says something about why fans were so vocal about wanting faster access in the first place. This particular series has held the record as the single most watched show in its network's entire history, and it ranked as the most watched comedy across all of basic cable during 4 separate seasons of its run. It has also won 2 Emmy Awards for Outstanding Animated Program, a significant and repeated honor within the television industry. Every single season the show has produced has received a certified fresh rating on the review aggregation site Rotten Tomatoes, and its critical scores frequently land in the 90th percentile or higher, meaning critics have remained consistently impressed with the show's quality, even many seasons into its run, a rare achievement for any series that has been on the air this long. Season 9 itself was set to roll out in more than 170 countries and in 42 different languages, giving some sense of just how large and spread out this show's total audience actually is, and helping explain why even a shortened few-week gap before streaming access still represented a genuinely significant number of people waiting to catch up. The network's own president, Michael Awaleen, spoke about the season in strongly positive terms as well, acknowledging that praising the show is essentially part of his job at this point, while insisting that the praise happens to be true regardless. He described the amount of talent and effort being poured into each new season as genuinely surprising this far into the show's run, and specifically praised the season's high-concept ideas, alongside what he called some of the best character writing the show has ever produced. None of this changes how any individual episode of Season 9 actually plays out on screen. A viewer watching There's Something About Morty, Erickerhead, or Requiem Mort a Dream would have no way of knowing, just from watching, that the season sat frozen for nearly 5 months during one of the longest labor disputes in the history of American television, or that its showrunner had been publicly pushing for years to shrink the gap between television and streaming release. But understanding that history adds real context to why this particular season felt like it arrived with an unusually large amount of confidence and polish behind it, backed by a production team that has spent years steadily solving problems, from a strike that froze the entire industry, to a leadership transition following a co-creator's departure, to a streaming release pattern that had frustrated fans for years, all of it resolving into 10 episodes that reach screens looking calm and settled despite everything sitting underneath them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same steady, long-term planning applies just as much to where the season was heading in its final 2 episodes, since Salute Your Morts and Field of Dreams were built to close out 10 episodes worth of story, while also setting the stage for everything the franchise already has planned for right after. Section 10. The finale nobody's seen yet. As of today, Salute Your Morts and Field of Dreams have not aired yet. Salute Your Morts is scheduled for July the 19th, and Field of Dreams, the season's actual finale, is scheduled for July the 26th. Everything covered here about these 2 episodes comes strictly from confirmed scheduling information and officially released plot details, not from watching either episode play out. And that distinction is worth stating plainly rather than blurring together with everything discussed earlier. Salute Your Morts
Morts sits as the 9th episode of the season and the 91st episode of the series overall once Field of Dreams is included. Its title follows the exact same wordplay pattern this show leans on for nearly every episode title it has ever produced, borrowing directly from Salute Your Shorts, a children's television series that aired on Nickelodeon and became known for its stories set at a fictional summer camp. Swapping the word shorts for morts keeps the joke instantly recognizable to anyone who remembers the original show, while immediately telling longtime viewers exactly what kind of setting this episode is likely built around before a single frame has aired. The official teaser line released for the episode backs that expectation up directly. It describes Morty and Summer being sent off to camp while Beth and Jerry stay behind at the house, splitting the Smith family into two separate storylines running at the same time, rather than sending the whole household on one shared adventure together. This kind of split structure is not new for the show. Across earlier seasons, Rick and Morty has used this exact setup more than once, dividing the family into smaller groups so different characters can carry their own separate plot without needing Rick or Morty sitting at the center of every single scene. Confirmed character listings for the episode include Morty Smith, Jerry Smith, Summer Smith, Beth Smith, and Principal Vagina, a recurring side character who has appeared across earlier seasons of the show, suggesting the camp storyline may circle back to a familiar face from the show's history rather than introducing an entirely new setting populated only with strangers. The episode's writing credits are already locked in as well.
The story is credited to Nick Rutherford, with the actual teleplay, meaning the finished script built from that story, credited to Albro Lundy and Jax Ball. Salute Your Morts carries a rating of TVMALV, marking it as the 13th episode across the show's entire history to receive that specific rating from the agency responsible for classifying television content in the United States. That rating sits above the TV-14 rating several other episodes this season have carried, suggesting whatever happens across this particular episode's two storylines leans somewhat rougher in content than a typical standalone adventure from earlier in the season. Field of Dreams closes out the season as its 10th and final episode, and it carries a piece of history that no other episode across this show's entire run has matched before it. It is the very first episode title in the show's history to share an identical word-for-word title with an existing piece of outside media, rather than reworking that title with the usual wordplay the show applies to almost everything else. Every other episode title across the show's run, including every other title from this exact season, takes something familiar and twists it slightly, swapping in the word Rick or Mort somewhere inside it. Field of Dreams breaks that pattern entirely, borrowing the exact title of the 1989 film of the same name without altering a single letter of it. Whether that choice was meant to carry some specific significance, marking the finale as different in tone or intention from every other episode around it, or whether it was simply a title the writers felt worked too well to bother changing, is not something officially confirmed. But breaking a naming pattern the show has followed consistently across 90 episodes is notable on its own, regardless of the reasoning behind it. The confirmed plot summary for the episode describes Rick Sanchez arriving at his daughter's doorstep after 20 years away, moving in with her family and setting up a laboratory in the garage before taking his grandson on new adventures across the universe. Anyone who has watched this show from its very beginning will recognize immediately how closely that description echoes the setup of the original pilot episode, which also opened with Rick reappearing in Beth's life and moving into her garage after a long absence, kicking off the entire series from that exact starting point. Seeing the finale's official synopsis circle back to language this close to the show's own origin, after 90 previous episodes and years of adventures across the multiverse, positions Field of Dreams as a deliberate echo of where this entire story first began. Whether the actual episode plays that echo, for laughs, for genuine emotional weight, or for something else entirely. One additional detail confirmed about the episode connects it to a completely different piece of classic literature. The official logline for Field of Dreams specifically mentions the titular character from The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, the well-known novel by Mark Twain about a mischievous boy growing up along the Mississippi River. How exactly that reference factors into the actual events of the episode has not been detailed publicly, but its inclusion in the official plot description suggests some kind of direct connection to that character or story shows up somewhere across the finale's runtime. Field of Dreams carries a rating of TV-14 DLV, a notch below the TVMA rating attached to Salute Your Morts the week before it, suggesting the finale itself may pull back slightly from whatever rougher content
content the second-to-last episode leans into.
The writer and director credits for the finale had not been publicly confirmed at the time of the most recent update, though one listing credits Michael Kellner as a writer on the episode, with further confirmation on the full creative team expected closer to the actual air date. The scheduling built around this finale ties directly back to everything already covered about the franchise's larger expansion. Field of Dreams airs at 11 at night on July the 26th, and 30 minutes later, at 11:30 that same night, the very first episode of President Curtis premieres directly afterward on the same network. That back-to-back scheduling was chosen deliberately, giving the brand new spin-off series the strongest possible lead-in audience by capturing viewers the moment the flagship show's own season wraps up. A Blu-ray and DVD release for the complete season has also already been locked in for November the 3rd, giving physical media collectors a concrete date to plan around well before the finale itself has even aired. Zooming out to the bigger picture, Season 9's ending was never going to function as any kind of true ending for the franchise as a whole. The show had already been renewed through a 10th season back in 2023, and that commitment was extended even further in 2024, locking the series in through a 12th season with 20 additional episodes on top of everything already guaranteed. That level of security keeps the show running through at least 2029, meaning whatever Field of Dreams actually does with its unusual title, its callback to the pilot setup, and its unexplained Tom Sawyer reference, none of it needs to resolve the show's story permanently. It only needs to close out these 10 episodes while handing the audience directly over to whatever comes next, whether that means President Curtis premiering minutes later that same night, or an eventual 10th season still waiting somewhere further down the road. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.